let's start with the beginning, Simon. Okay, at the beginning, like me, you were born at a very young age. And I know your spiritual journey, your journey began when you were roughly 7 years old. Tell us a story of what happened in West Norfolk when you were 7.
Goodness me, so I'm casting my mind back many, many years. So before we moved here to Chim in 1983, we were living in a very rural parish. It was Dad's first parish after he was a curate in West Norfolk called Grimston. And I never understood, and I'm looking at people like Brian Kennett who were very much central to these, why vicars always had so many meetings. When Dad was here, he had meetings coming out of his ears. I never understood this. And being in Norfolk was no different. And it was a Saturday morning in rural Norfolk, and Dad had been in meetings all morning. The rain had been falling all morning. We lived in the fields, very rural area. And we were going a little bit crazy. This is hard to believe now, but back then there were just 3 television channels, BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. There were some kids' programs on in the morning, but not a huge amount. So myself, Becky, my younger sister, and Hannah, who was very young at this point, were all going a bit stir crazy. There was nothing to do. I was that age, I just wanted to be out and about, enjoying myself in the fields. So after lunch, I think Dad could recognize that we were all going a bit stir crazy. So he suggested we went out as a family to walk in some woods near where we lived in Grimston called Massingham Forest. And so the sun was shining by this point. Now we went for this lovely walk, and it was basically a pine forest. I was at the age where I had to climb trees, so I was a little bit disappointed. If you know anything about pine trees, they're not very climbable. But in amongst this forest, as the sun shone, was this one tree. And it was like a yew tree, big old thing. And I could see it was climbable. So up immediately I went into this tree. And I sort of came down eventually and sat in between the 2 huge bits of the trunk in the kind of middle. And I remember Dad was sort of stood here holding Hannah, who was very young at this point, and Becky was there, and Mum was here. And it started raining again. And Mum suggested that we move from where we were to the other side of the clearing to get some shelter. This made absolutely no sense because we were already sheltered. We were perfectly sheltered from the rain that was falling. And Mum said it again about a minute later. Dad's response was, "Oh, come on, Jill, we don't need to move." And I'm like, "Mum, what are you on about?" And then about a minute later, she said it for a 3rd time. Up until this point, my faith really was, I loved going to church. A lot of my best friends were at church. I knew about this God figure that Dad spoke about from the front that I would hear in Sunday school. But it all felt a little bit out there somewhere, not necessarily something particularly real and tangible. And my mum said for a 3rd time, and all these years later, I can still see the look in Mum's eyes. I can still hear the tone in her voice. And she said, "I think we need to move, and we need to move now." And I think Dad just wanted an easy life at this point. So he said, "Come on, Simon, down you get out the tree." I grumpily, as a 7-year-old would, get out of the tree. And down we go and across to the other side of the clearing. I reckon it was about 30 seconds later. And I can still hear it now. I can still see it now. I can almost smell it now. This incredible noise came through the forest that I would describe as sounding like a tornado jet coming through the forest. And then this almighty bang and this almighty thud. And as the smoke cleared and our screams died down, the tree that I'd just been sat in, and that's my mum there on the left, that's little Hannah, she's holding there. The tree where I'd been sat only moments before had been hit by what is known as ball lightning. And it had been left looking like that. Almost certainly, I would not be here today had Mum not asked us to move. The reason why that photo got taken, Ken, is that later that evening, some lovely friends of ours who we're still very good friends with, called the Bowers family, who are part of our church in Grimston, wanted to go back. They'd heard the story. And as we stood there around this tree, a little bit calmer than we were a few hours ago, Rosemary said to my mum, having heard the story, and there was so much about it that didn't make sense, "Why would you move when you're already sheltered?" She said, "What was it? What was it?" And Mum said, "I just heard this voice. I heard this voice, and I believe it was the voice of God saying, move, and move now." So I don't know, had that moment not happened, had God not spoken to Mum on that day, and some who are not Christians will say, wonderful coincidence. But actually years later, I was speaking at an event, an amazingly prophetic man came up to me. Some of you will know him. He's no longer with us, called Gerald Coates, came up to me. He didn't know anything about my story. And he just said, "I've got a word for you." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "When you were around about 7, something happened to you that made you realize this God that you followed was real? I said, oh yeah, I nearly got killed by lightning. I didn't say it quite as casually as that. But I look back on that, Ken, that moment on that day, that God very firmly put his hand upon my shoulder. And actually our family, we would not have ended up here, I don't think, in Chim, had God not spoken to Mum in that moment, and Mum had been obedient and said, let's move, and I grumpily was obedient to my mum.
Now, to interrupt you a bit, because it's like to get a drink of water out of a fire hydrant. Not quite so dramatic, but of course there's some people here know your dad was very involved, of course, in leading the Cromer Beach mission. And in 1982, in the summer of 1982, there was a high-level conference, as you know, behind a beach hut on Cromer seafront during the mission, with a certain Douglas Kahn, who was the founding father of here, and your dad, to say, how about coming to Chim? So you came to Chim in 1983. The first encounter we had was you put a cricket ball through my greenhouse window.
It was a lovely shot.
It was and just to say, it's great to have you here. You know, our kids, Mark and Ali, grew up together. What are your memories here of St Paul's as you grew up here in the youth? Got any striking memories, any funny memories at all, or are they all lost in oblivion as you got older?
No, I've got loads of memories. I remember it being a massive culture shock coming from rural Norfolk to Chim. It was huge. My mum and dad felt that the best way to adjust to it would be to stick me in boarding school at a place called Aberdour near Banstead in Burheath, which I think you might remember. I lasted 2 weeks as a boarder. It was founded for vicar's sons, so basically we went on the free. A vicar clearly cannot afford public school. And I tried to escape twice. It was just such a massive culture shock. I'd gone from finishing school at 3:15, suddenly I'm in this weird school where they call you by your surname. They talk about things called tuck boxes. I'd never heard of this. They have Saturday school, and I'm boarding, and it was just a nightmare. But once things calmed down and Mum and Dad realised that was a really bad move, and I became a day pupil, and I'd come home every night, I loved it here. This place, and obviously the building of this building, it's a little bit older than when we were here, but that happened during Dad's time as vicar here. And actually we were sharing a story of when it opened in 1989. I was desperate to know how Norwich were doing in the FA Cup semi-final. We're both Norwich fans, by the way. And this is long, long before the internet, before social media, before any of that. So once the service had finished, I legged it back to the house, which is just next door, and turned on the radio. And of course, rather than hearing what was happening to Norwich in that semi-final, Hillsborough was unfolding in that April of 1989. So this place has a lot of special memories for me. One of my first loves was Fiona McAllister, and her parents are here. I just thought I'd mention that, you know, teenage love and all that. But all my best friends, you know, Toby was, like he always was on sort of lookout duty when I arrived a few hours ago, looking out for me. He was one of the first guys I met here. But I grew up in a church where actually most of my really good friends, some of whom I'm still in touch with, quite a few I'm not, were part of this church. And saw Steve Russell earlier. He was my Explorer leader for a bit. You were YPF. And it was a really special time, because that period of life, going into your teens, and it's a confusing period. You're grumpy when your dad picks you up from Chim Station, asks you how you got on at school that day. You've got like one answer. And I'm now seeing that with my boy Ethan, those monosyllabic times, and other times he's absolutely fine. But we had a really happy time here, and we left in 1995 as I finished university. And I always look back on that time of Dad's ministry. Yeah, he had a lovely time in Beccles in Suffolk before he finally retired. This really, in terms of my faith journey, in terms of enjoying church, in terms of growing up with other youngsters who are Christians, this is where I had the best time.
And you're part of a generation, actually, of ex-youth members here who have travelled the world, actually, and who've been involved. Some have struggled with faith, but others have triumphed, in a sense, or worked through things. And you might be interested to know that another of the ex-youth, in 2 months' time, will be sitting here, and that's Alison, our daughter, who's a GP in central Sheffield in a deprived area, talking about the frontiers of medicine. So that's another story. You went off to university. You went to Birmingham, I know, same time as Ali was there, and you read history, I think. How did you get into Blue Peter? Because how does one get? Did you just get lucky down the job centre, or how do you get into Blue Peter?
Yeah, just below cleaner in my local job centre, it said Blue Peter presenter required. I thought, no. It was, goodness me, it was a long journey. I really caught the bug for broadcasting Some people remember this, a lot won't, but back in the kind of 90s, Steve Chalk, who runs the Oasis Trust, ran this project called Radio Cracker. I don't know how they managed it, but they managed to get a load of local radio licenses for a period in December of that year. And the one that we had here in Chim, I think, was up at St Andrew's Church, further up Northey Avenue. And myself, a guy called Silas Edmonds, who was coming here for a while, Kristen Meadows, who I'm still very, very good friends with. The Meadows family were here when my parents were here. And a certain guy called Tim Vine. We did some radio shows on it, and I got a real bug for it. I thought, I love this. I love this art of communicating. Listen, I know that next to nobody is listening, but I'm enjoying this. So I went to university in 1992, went to Birmingham. I read history, as you said. It's been absolutely good for nothing. I've forgotten probably 2/3 of it. But in that first weekend as a fresh, you go round the kind of society fair, and there are all the sports societies and lots of various other societies, the societies for the rich students like Hot Air Ballooning Club. And I saw this one called Guild TV. Now, if you know anything about universities, the Guild at any university is where kind of all the societies are, the bars are, the restaurants are. And I saw Guild TV, and I thought, what's that? So I went up to the stand, and they told us that we have a proper TV station at the university. We have a proper studio, a proper gallery. They've got all this second-hand equipment from an old BBC studio in Birmingham that some of you will remember. It's long gone, called Pebble Mill. It's where all the morning output used to come from. And this guy had got all this second-hand equipment, so they built this proper TV studio and everything. And I said, I want to do this. So for the first few months, I was what we call in the business a runner, which is essentially making teas and coffees for people and getting nothing really in return. But after a few months, they said, do you want to present a Friday morning show called The Lunchbox? I said, yes, please. So I presented it with another girl. Nobody watched it. It went out on the monitors in the students' bars long before widescreen TVs. It was on mute, so no one could hear it. No one's watching it. But you got an experience of what it was like to present in a multi-camera studio. 3 cameras, an earpiece to listen to your director and your producer, all the kind of raw elements that go into live TV. And even though no one paid it the blind bit of notice, even my housemates didn't really know what I was doing every Friday lunchtime, I started doing this show. And I came out of university, and I remember this producer came up to me and said, what are you going to do next? And I said, I want to go into broadcasting, I want to go into Blue Peter. She said, go for it. Go for it. And I went back to Beccles that summer, and just briefly, this was another moment in which God, in a very direct way, said, this is the way forward for you. So I came out of university. I'm aiming for Blue Peter. I want to get a break. I don't know how long it's going to take. I gave myself 3 years. And it's a hot July afternoon in Beccles in Suffolk. Dad's had a lot of those meetings again, quelle surprise. But he's going out that afternoon, and he's got his old, what would now be described as a retro Apple Macintosh computer. I need to get on that computer to write letters to various broadcasters, Blue Peter, to try and get some work experience, to try and get my foot on the ladder. I'm going to make a showreel tape, which is a short tape of you presenting, to send in to Blue Peter. And just before I went down to Dad's office, he's finally gone out, I thought, I haven't really at any stage in this involved God. Never once have I thought, is this something that actually God wants me to do, or is this just a pipe dream? Thomas just fancies a bit of fame, he fancies a bit of Blue Peter, or whatever might happen. And I thought, I really need to pray about this. And I really do believe that sometimes we dress our prayers up. God's in the business of just being direct. He knows exactly what's going on in our hearts. And I was really direct. I said, God, I do not want to waste the next 3 years of my life chasing a dream that I don't even know if you're part of. I said, please just give me a sign. I'm not about to waste these years. Amen. Go down to Dad's study. I've got my book of all the addresses of various editors. There's no proper internet at this point, so you can't go online and find them all like you could now. And just before I wrote that first letter, I saw a pile of Dad's Christian magazines on the left-hand side of his desk. And there was one magazine. And on those kind of subheaders of the articles in the magazines was this one article that had been written by Steve Chalk, who I mentioned earlier, and Pam Rhodes, who at the time was presenting Songs of Praise on the BBC. And the headline was, Why We Need More Christians in the Media. And I was like, goodness me. So I feverishly turned to this article, and I'm no doubt about it, you've probably been sat in this building or at meetings and other churches where you hear a talk, and as you sit there and you hear it, it feels like that talk is only ever being said for you. It's like you feel like you're the only person in the room. So I read this article. It was like it had been written for me. And it was very much this, which is Jesus was a figure who didn't sit on the outskirts of Jerusalem and say, I'm going to wait for you guys to come to me. He went into where the people were. He got involved in society and the people around him. And Steve and Pam were saying in this article, if you want to see a change in what you're seeing on your television screens, if you want to see a change in what you're hearing on your radio, if you want to see a change in what you're reading on your newspapers as Christians, the only way that change will come, yes, you can set up your own radio stations, is to get involved. So we need, they said, more Christian presenters, more Christian editors, more Christian journalists, more Christian cameramen and women. And I was like, wow, that's the green light. So off I went. And in the end, it took nearly 4 years to get that break. I had 2 failed attempts where I got nothing more than a thanks, we'll keep your details on file letter back from Blue Peter. I know what that means. It means basically not a chance. And then I'd pretty much given up. And then in the sort of autumn of 1998, a mate of mine texted me and said, go and get the news of the world. Not something I used to read. And on the front cover is this story about Richard Bacon, who at the time had been a presenter on Blue Peter for 2 years. And he'd been caught out taking Class A drugs on a night out. I knew immediately when I saw that, there's no way he's going to survive. You cannot have a presenter doing that on Blue Peter. And within 48 hours, he had been sacked, and I knew they needed another presenter. And I remember I was working for the Oasis Trust at the time. Someone came up to me and said, you've got to go for it. And I said, I just don't want to deal with the disappointment anymore. But she said, you've got to go for it. So I did. And I had a charity video I presented on. I thought, I'm just going to send that in. I remember going to a post box in southwest London where I was working at the time. And as I put it through the top bit of the post box, this old VHS tape and my CV, I just prayed, God, if this is your will, let it be done. Amen. And a month later, after an interview at the famous Blue Peter audition, I got the job, and it was surreal but amazing.
How long did you present Blue Peter for? Just in terms of
6 years.
6 years,
yeah.
Right. Now, during that 6 years, you must have enormous number of memories, okay, about that. And I'd love to hear more and more, but we've got a lot to get through in the next 40 minutes or so. Highlights, we've got one on video, which we can show in a minute, for a vertigo-inducing experience to watch this. But before we show that, any other things? The thing I mentioned to you was when you met the late Queen, and I think you had to present her with a Blue Peter badge. Tell us what happened with that.
Yeah, so this was the Queen's Golden Jubilee, and she was coming, she visited lots of different organisations as part of her Golden Jubilee, and the BBC was one of them. And the 2 aspects of the BBC and Television Centre in Wood Lane were BBC News and Blue Peter. So we were like, wow. So we had to pre-record this segment that will go out in the show on the Monday evening where the Queen came to visit the studio. So we had lots of old presenters from the past. So Valerie Singleton was there, Peter Purvis, Peter Duncan, Simon Groom, Sarah Green, people like that. People I'd grown up watching were there, old editors as well. And there was going to be a long line of these ex-presenters and editors, and all the way up to the current editor, the current presenters. And the editor of the programme, Richard, said, Simon, you are going to give the Queen a gold Blue Peter badge, so you'll be the last person in the queue. And I said, okay. He said, the reason why we're giving it to you, you're the least likely to mess up your words. Okay, I'll take that. So about 20 minutes before Her Majesty the Queen arrives, her press officer comes round. I can't remember her name, but she was very haughty. She was everything I expected. And she came down the entire queue and she asked, what are you going to say to the Queen? Everyone was supposed to just tell a very quick story. So she eventually gets to me and I say, well, I've got a gag. And she just looks at me and says, Queen doesn't do gags. What is it? So I told her the gag, and she said, you can't say that. I'll be back in 5 minutes, think of something else. So I said to my editor, what on earth am I going to say? I've thought about this joke for a long time. It was going to work. I'm going to make the Queen laugh. But eventually this woman came back and said, if you stick to those words, you can say it. I mean, for goodness sake, I could have said anything. I mean, she can't control it once the Queen comes in. And so she said, you can go with it. So in comes the Queen. It's if you've ever met the Queen or been in her presence when she was alive, there's that feeling of familiarity because she was ever present for all of us. You feel like you know her. It feels like it's your grandma coming into the TV studio. But then, of course, you go, my goodness me, it's Her Majesty the Queen. So in she comes. She comes down this long line. I never forget Liz Barker, who I presented with, was going to tell the Queen a very brief story about an amazingly powerful film she made where she took a group of school children to Auschwitz. And poor old Liz, you could see the kind of nerves getting the better of everybody as they came down the line. When it got to Liz, the editor said, "This is Liz Barker." And rather than Liz telling this rather lovely, powerful story, she just went, "I've been to Auschwitz." And the Queen just went, "Oh, how lovely," and moved straight on and left dear old Liz hanging. And then it got to me, and there she was, the Queen's right in front of me, and I was to give her a gold Blue Peter badge. So I said, "Your Majesty, on behalf of the programme, I'd like to give you the programme's highest award. It is a gold Blue Peter badge, and you might be interested to know you can get into the Tower of London free with this." And the Queen laughed. And off she went. And it was really bizarre, because that evening I kept getting interviewed by various news programmes asking me how I, like the Queen never laughed before, how I made the Queen laugh. But it was one of those moments, and when she passed away a couple of years ago, it was a story I told many times, because I count myself as a real, very, very fortunate to have had that moment.
Of course, and that came out with the whole episode, didn't it, with the marmalade sandwich in her handbag, and Paddington thing. Other things about Blue Peter, before we look at this piece of video, other things that you did? I mean, can you give us a sketch in the typical week, or is no typical week? What was it like?
I think the remarkable thing about Blue Peter, and I was very lucky because I would say, without being too kind of grand about it was the last era of the golden age of kids' TV before everything fragmented. I look at my boy Ethan now, and he largely watches YouTube. They don't watch linear TV, youngsters. So I was very blessed to be a presenter during that period. Back then, a really good show would get between 6 and 7 million people watching it. That's gold dust for Saturday night primetime shows on the BBC or ITV now. So a totally different era to what we have now. But when I look back on it, it's those experiences that money can't buy, that it gave you, that you look back on and go, wow, I did that. I think back to a trip. The travel for me was one of the most amazing things. As a family, we didn't really travel. I think we had one foreign holiday in 1989, which was to Barbados, that a group of people here very kindly helped us to go and see our cousins. That was the only foreign holiday we ever did. I was so untraveled. But I remember going to film in the Solomon Islands, which are miles away. They're a 3-hour flight from Brisbane in the Pacific. And we had a 2-week filming trip there, when we went round these islands with this group of brothers called the Melanesian Brotherhood, amazing Christian men who would go and evangelize and provide pastoral care and also medical care to lots of these very remote islands. And on one particular day, and this is one of those experiences you look back on and think, did that really happen? We were going to film with the last remaining pagan priest in the entire Solomon Islands. So we arrive at this amazing, beautiful island. I mean, it's such a stunning area. And it's tiny. This island, you could walk from top to bottom of the island in probably 10 minutes. It was so small. And we landed on the boat. We got out with the camera crew and my director. And we were told to head towards the far end of the island where this little wooded glade was. And they said the pagan priest is in there. So off we went. We knew he didn't speak a word of English. We got our translator with us. And we walked towards this wooded area, and into the wooded area we go. I can see this elderly man sat in the middle of this little wooded area on this box, and there's a big box next to him. And as we're walking through, I'm kind of looking around me, and there's these bones. There's a lot of bones. I'm thinking they're quite big bones. I'm thinking, what animals have been sacrificed in this little wooded area? I'm then seeing human skulls. I'm going, what on earth is this? And as we sat there amongst all of this and began to interview him and through the translator, turns out that they were the remains of his ancestors. And in that wooden box that sat to his left was the remains of the last pagan priest. And he was the last one, the last surviving one in the entire Solomon Islands. And it was just an incredible experience. For some, it would be probably quite a grim experience, but I just found it kind of head spinning, really, that you were in the miles and miles and miles away from home. And at the end, I wish I'd sent this photo. Sorry I didn't, but I wasn't going to tell this story until you asked. I said through the translator, because he seemed just a very chilled out guy for a pagan priest sitting amongst the remains of his ancestors. I said, could I have a photo with one of his ancestors? So the translator spoke to him. He just sort of laughed, and the translator said, yeah, of course you can. So I've got this picture somewhere at home of me holding this skull, which is one of his ancestors, and I'm kind of giving it that Hamlet look. And I think back to moments like that and think I was immensely privileged for 6 years to do things that a lot of people will never get to do.
Yeah, in my head, I have a feeling in the future of you holding a skull of your former YPF leader.
Hey, listen, you're the Peter Pan. You're the Peter Pan of St. Paul's. You don't look any different.
You talked about head spinning, and that might lead us into that video clip. Do you want to introduce it, first of all?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do on Blue Peter for a long, long time was to skydive. I'd always wanted to do it, and it's a film that had been done many times down the years, from John Noakes to Janet Ellis to Stuart Miles. We'd been done quite a number of times. But the time was to revisit. A new generation of viewers had come through. A time to do this one again. So in a nutshell, the plan was for me to do a display jump with the RAF Falcons, who are their parachute display team, and to do it at an air show in the UK. It hadn't been decided, the next summer. So I was going to go out to the west coast of America, to San Diego, where the Falcons go every winter to train, because it's blue skies every day, so you can jump pretty much every day, unlike the UK in winter. So out we went. I was going to do the accelerated freefall course, which was to learn how to skydive, to learn how to freefall, and then eventually learn how to do formation skydives. The way it worked was every time we jumped and got safely back down to the ground, we would go into a little hut at the drop zone, and the guys would show me a video back of how your jump went. And you would jump out with an instructor either side of you. So my instructors were Toby and Roger, and they'd hold on to this ribbed bit on the sidearm, and they would help you as you were coming down to get your body position right in the air. So you're dropping at terminal velocities, so it's 120 miles per hour. And it's really important when you come to pulling your chute at 5,500 feet that you are in the right body position. Because if you're not, then you can get into twists, and you open the parachute and your parachute's a twisted knot, which is no use to anyone. So that was the kind of training. And after every jump, Toby and Roger would sit there with me and say, right, you got this right, this is what you need to do better next time. Meanwhile, they're packing your parachute, and you get back in the plane, you go up. I think we got to jump number 4 or 5. The video will tell me which one it was. And out we go. We're jumping at 14,500 feet. So it's around about 50 seconds free fall before you have to pull your chute. And we get to that pull your chute height of 5,500 feet. And as I went to pull it and I pulled it out, nothing happens. And it felt a lot longer than it actually was. But I do remember, amidst the chaos and the noise of that wind rushing past you at that speed, just this sensation that someone is punching me on the back, but I don't know why. And then thankfully, this chute appears above my head moments later, and all was okay. Until I went back into the hut again. The Falcons did say in later days, we should never have shown you this. We should have just got you back in the plane and just gone and done it. Ignorance is bliss. I watched this video, and there, as I'm dropping through the air and I pulled my chute, that punching I can feel was Toby and Roger, because basically the little spring-loaded drone that fires up and then catches the end, pulls the chute out, didn't come out. And so they were punching my backpack to get this little drone chute out, and then eventually it came out. I mean, my heart ran cold. I just lost my bottle, and I thought, I just can't do this again. I cannot go up there and do this again. And they managed to persuade me to do another jump. This actually turned out to be my last jump, and I think we've got the video of this was the jump after the one that didn't go too well.
Hold on to your seats and close your eyes.
I don't know what triggered it, but I'd had a bad night thinking about freefall and all the implications if things went wrong. As we left the ground, this unease turned into something more serious and very unsettling. Fear.
I don't want to do this.
Hey? Huh? Listen.
Right, relax.
Relax. You can do it.
For those of you who have known real fear, only you will know how I felt. I had to make a very hard decision, to stay in the plane or to jump. I decided to jump. My mind was paralyzed with fear, and I forgot all my flight checks. There was one positive. Roger and Toby let go, and for the first time, I was solo.
Hey, take care of me.
I've never been as scared in my life as I was before I went out the door. And I don't know why, that's my 6th jump, but at the moment, every jump for me is getting worse. I just feel less and less like I want to do it, and I don't know why.
Check in. Okay. Check out.
Okay.
Up, down, horizon, altitude, 9,000 feet.
So what happened is, I made one final jump after that awful jump, and the rest of the trip, to be honest, was a bit of a disaster. I didn't jump again, so we went home, tail between our legs, and we made a film that actually, in the end, resonated with the youngsters watching it, because it basically said, do you know, sometimes in life it's okay to fail, and you will fail at things, and even us Blue Peter presenters don't always achieve what we want to achieve. Later that spring, I decided to see if I could get my bottle back. So I did 4 jumps at a place called Weston on the Green near RAF Bryce Norton in Oxfordshire, and I got my bottle back. So I went to the program and said, do you think we could go back to San Diego and we do a film about conquering fear? And they took a bit of persuading because it's a really expensive film to make because of the film crews flying out there and everything, but they said yes. So back we went. And you will know in life that sometimes sights and sounds, a bit like coming back here today, it fires off so many different memories. Walking back into here today fires off all those memories of our time here as a family. We were staying in exactly the same hotel. As I walked back into the Holiday Inn in downtown San Diego, that feeling of fear from the year before came flooding back, and I'm like, oh my days. I didn't sleep a wink that night, because all through the night, this same recurring thought was happening, and it was this. You essentially, when you skydive, and it is one of the safest sports out there, it doesn't look it, but it actually is, but you are putting your trust in 2 loads of nylon string and 2 bits of fabric. If they both fail, you will find out tomorrow if that God that you followed all of your life is actually true or not. I just couldn't sleep. I woke up the next morning, went down to breakfast. It's the same director I had a year ago. And he looked at me and says, you're white as a sheet, what's going on? I just blamed it on the jet lag. I said, I didn't say this to him, but I cannot do this. So anyway, I've got a really good friend called Phil Wall, who some of you may know. He's been a Christian leader and figure for many, many years. And he's been like a Christian mentor to me down the years. And he'd said before going, so I was quite nervous, if you ever have a problem, ring me. So anyway, I thought I'm going to go and get some donuts for the RAF boys to eat on the half-an-hour trip to the drop zone from the hotel. So I cross over the road, and just before I go in, I thought I'm going to give Phil a ring. And it's nighttime back in the UK. I ring Phil. He picks up straight away. I said, Phil, and I explained what was happening. I'm in real trouble. He said, I'm going to pray for you right now. Because I said, this is the mental battle I have. Is God real or not? He said, Bud, I'm going to pray for you right now. And his prayer was really simple. On this street corner in San Diego, he said, God, I pray right now that Simon would know in a really tangible way that you are true, and that he would go out and he would just do it. Amen. And he said, go and do it, bud. And I said, bye-bye, got the donuts. As I'm waiting to walk back across the highway, back to the hotel, and this is literally 5 minutes after that prayer was just said, I feel a tap on my right shoulder. I look round, there's a young guy that I've never seen in my entire life before who stood there looking at me. I'm not going to do the San Diego accent, but he just looked at me and he said, I just want you to know Jesus loves you and is for real. I kind of looked ahead again, startled. I looked back and this guy has disappeared. There was nowhere that he could have ran that quickly. And I sometimes believe, and I really do believe with this, is that we have a very, I guess, cliched idea of what an angel looks like. We think of kind of wings and a glow, but actually God uses angels in human form. And that video that you just watched its genesis was in that moment. That prayer from Phil, that moment minutes later when God said, I am for real, and I thought, he's got my back in this. The first jump you saw was quite nerve-wracking, but by the end of that week, I am doing somersaults at the back of a plane. That was part of the training, by the way. That wasn't just me showing off. And over the course of that 10 days, I did about 50 jumps. And I had the best time ever, but it could only happen because God put his hand on my shoulder through that young guy who I believe was an angel and said, this God that you follow, like I reminded you when you were 7, is real, and I've got your back.
It's an inspirational story. Tell us about football now. How did you get into football? We haven't got, I'm looking at the clock, so...
Yeah, don't worry. Look, I mean, I've loved sport my entire life. We're both Norwich fans, so you've got to really love it to stick with Norwich through the thick and the thin. It's a little bit thin at the moment. We've had our thick times as well. But I've always loved sport. And my plan when I got onto Blue Peter was to plan next. A lot of people said, you're made for life now, not in terms of money, but in terms of jobs, that you'll get loads of offers. I never believed that, not because I'm necessarily a glass half full kind of person, but just I didn't think I had the arrogance just to assume that I would get loads of offers. And I thought, I need to plan what I want to do next, and I want to get into sports broadcasting. I want to become a sports presenter, so that was the plan. And over the course of my time on Blue Peter, I did lots of sports films. I started working a little bit for BBC Sport in my last couple of years. I do some reporting on the marathon, the Great North Run, and everything was pointing towards, when I left Blue Peter, heading into BBC Sport. And to cut a long story short, I never forget this, it's about 2 months before I'm leaving Blue Peter. And I go in to see the head of BBC Sport, a guy called Philip Burney, and I told him of my hopes and my plans. I said, I'll start anywhere. I don't want to be a runner, but I don't expect to go in straight away as Match of the Day presenter, but I want to get into sports reporting, so I want to be sent out and do match reports on 5 Live for those midweek games. And he looked at me, totally unmoved by everything I said, and just said, I don't see a kids presenter working in sport. And that was the end of the meeting. And I walked out absolutely poleaxed. I thought there was going to be something here. There's going to be absolutely nothing. I left Blue Peter in April 2005. In fact, I remember sat in a pub with Toby the day after he came to visit me in southwest London where I was living. And I remember saying to Toby, right now, having had 6 of the most amazing, amazing years of my life, I have no job. I have nothing to go to. Suddenly, it felt bereft in terms of what I was going to do. And in the end, I went to Sky with my agent, and we had a long conversation with them. And they were good enough to give me a couple of screen tests. I ended up working on Sky Sports News. And I spent about 5 years there learning the craft of being a sports journalist. I had the broadcasting experience, so I was able to lean on that and not worry about that, and get good and competent at asking good questions, of following sporting narratives. And then I started getting given the Football League, so I started presenting live football games for Sky. I did the 2015. This was the hardest challenge of my life, presenting the playoff final in the Championship between Norwich and Middlesbrough, having to remain utterly unbiased the whole way through. And we won 2-0, so it was all fine in the end.
I was there.
You were there?
Yeah, I was there.
Oh, it was an amazing day. To be part of that day and to be pitch side as the players ran out when the full-time whistle went was an amazing privilege. And after that, I kind of graduated to the Premier League. So I did a season and a bit on the Premier League in the end. So my plan when I joined Sky in 2005 was, with whatever it would take, that same determination that kept me hanging in there during those waiting for Blue Peter years, was to get to the top at Sky, to go all the way through to presenting Premier League football. And I got there, but then as we are going to come on to talk about it, it all got snatched away.
Yeah, I mean, before we just cover that, those years, which you've been so honest about, and we'll deal with that in just a minute, I'm curious, as someone who occasionally watches Sky Sports Soccer Saturday, I used to watch it with the legendary Jeff Stelling, who was the most fast-talking, machine gun kind of commentator. For those who don't know, briefly describe how the system works and what happens on a Saturday afternoon.
Okay, if you've never seen Soccer Saturday, in a nutshell, it is a 6-hour show that goes on air at 12, it comes off air at 6 o'clock, and it covers every game in the Premier League, the Championship, League One, League Two, the National League, and the 4 Scottish leagues, particularly from 3 o'clock. So we are like an updating score service that you watch. We have 5 pundits in the studio, all former footballers, who watch the Premier League games. We have a legion of about 15 reporters out watching the Championship games and some other games. We have 3 hours of what I would describe as gentle build-up, which is kind of football chat, updating the early live games, and then the only way I can describe it is 3 o'clock comes and all hell breaks loose, because at 3 o'clock on an average Saturday, around about 65 games kick off simultaneously in 9 different leagues. And my job, and it still fills me with fear when I think about it, and I've been doing it for a season and a bit, is to be what I would describe as the conductor of the next 3 hours, which is updating people with the scores where we don't have reporters, going to my guests in the studios as big incidents happen and goals go in, and going to our reporters as goals go in the Championship and League One and League Two. It is the most chaotic thing I've ever worked on. It's the hardest show I've ever worked on by an absolute country mile. You think about it, 65 teams, 65 games, times by 2 teams, times by 11 starting players. I've got an amazing stats guy called Trev, who's always in my ear with little nutmegs and little golden bits of information about that's that striker's first goal since October 2014 at home, or whatever it might be. It's the most incredible fun and ridiculous show I've ever worked on. It's 6 hours every week. We started the season off with a short 8-hour show as the season began. So we went on air at 12, came off at 8. There's no time to rest. I can't even eat. So I drink these Huel things, just like meals in a bottle. The only time I get to break and go to the loo is during advert breaks. So it's 6 hours of football fun and football chaos.
But does the preparation start before that? I mean, what about, the rest of this week, for example, is Thursday and Friday before you're on air on Saturday?
Well, I'm lucky it's an international break, so I've got this Saturday off, which is delightful. So there's no Premier League, no Championship this weekend, and then I'll be back on it. It's around about 4 days. People just think, and I brought Ethan in, so Ethan's my nearly 15-year-old boy. He came in with me at the weekend, and I loved what he said to me on the way home. He says, it really annoys me that my friends just think you work on a Saturday, because of course they only see it go out on a Saturday. He said, I now realise why you work so hard, because I work from really Tuesday through to Friday. There's 65 matches of stats to put together, and then of course there's the 3-hour build-ups of thinking through questions, thinking through what the interesting talking points of the week. So it is a 5-day week. It's 4 days of kind of working at home, a couple of meetings with the team online on a Tuesday and a Friday. So people only see the end result, but I always hold on to the phrase that Sir Alex Ferguson used to use with the Manchester United team a lot, which was, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. And that's one of those shows, if you go into it underprepared, it will bite you on the backside very quickly.
I remember in one of the interviews I saw on film of you sent me, you said to the guy who was interviewing you that you had a little prayer sometimes, asking for God's help.
I always pray. Because I wasn't sure this job was for me. I'd had a couple of years in the wilderness, career-wise, freelancing. I had bits and bobs, but this was my first real return to full-time sports broadcasting, and it filled me with fear. Jeff Stelling did it for 25 years, and he was amazing. It's also taking over from him. It's taking on a show that, as I've just described, is so tough in terms of the amount of variables every single week. And my prayer throughout the whole process last summer was, God, if this is not from you, please shut the door. Please shut the door. If I'm honest, I was kind of hoping he was going to shut the door, but he never did shut the door. And the door remained open and I got the job. So I know that God goes with me. I know that he has put me in this place. And so every Saturday, particularly when I'm struggling with anxiety, which I still do at times, I sink to my knees in my dressing room and I pray. I just say, God, go before me today. Be in my conversations. Help me to remember all the work that I've put in, keep me mentally alert. And then just before we go on air at midday, as the countdown 30 seconds to on air begins, where I'm sat at my desk in the studio, I would just shut my eyes briefly and just give it to God.
We have a countdown thing here on a Sunday, you're ticking down.
Yeah.
Very successfully in terms of Blue Peter, in terms of moving to football, going along swimmingly, married to Gemma, got a son, Ethan, and then something happened which changed your life and tested your faith. Tell us a bit about that.
This was all happening near 7 years ago. So it was the autumn of 2017. So I was into my second season of presenting the Premier League. And I'd loved the first season. I found the level of scrutiny that covering the Premier League put upon you quite hard at times. But I'd really enjoyed it. And I got to my second season. And by this point, Ethan is 8 years of age. And we'd had some fertility issues. I mean, we couldn't have any more kids. We'd worked through that. It'd been a really tough time about 3 years before that. And I went into this new season really looking forward to it. And then really out of absolutely nowhere, as we kind of went through September, I started to get this really horrible anxiety every time I thought about work. That kind of sick feeling you get ahead of a big exam where you probably haven't done enough work. And it just began to build. And it built and it built over kind of September and October. It made working really, really hard, and it made it exhausting. If you've ever struggled with anxiety, it's really exhausting. And also it feels like the foundations on which your life have been built are beginning to tremble. And then it began to manifest itself in panic attacks. So I was starting to have regular panic attacks before going on air. And I remember one in particular I had at Old Trafford covering a Manchester United game on a Saturday lunchtime. And I'm just in the studio. I've not slept the night before. The anxiety's so strong. And I remember just sat in the studio. I think I was with Graham Souness and Jamie Redknapp, and we're about 20 minutes before going on air, and I can just feel the kind of that hot flush feeling. I'm beginning to sweat. I can feel my heart going rapidly, and my breaths are getting quicker. And I thought I need to get out really quickly. And I ran across the bar that sits adjacent to the TV studio at Old Trafford to find the disabled loo. And I know I shouldn't normally use that, but I knew that there wouldn't be football fans in that loo, and it was free, and I just shut the door. And I remember just sobbing and just like, I cannot do this. I remember ringing Gemma and just saying I'm in all sorts of trouble. I remember her praying down the phone a really powerful prayer, and I got back to my feet and somehow got on air at 12 o'clock. It's a really weird thing, kind of mental health struggles and anxiety, is that actually for me, the freeing moment was going on air. A lot of people would think going on air, that must be utterly horrendous because you're so exposed, but it's that fight or flight thing. When midday came and the director's assistant said, we're on air, you either fly, which I couldn't really do, or you fight. And I would fight, but I'd come off air and just feel absolutely exhausted, and it kept going. To eventually we got to the point in late October where Sky said, we're going to take you out the firing line. We're going to give you a period to get yourself better, to deal with the anxiety, to get on top of the panic attacks, which was amazing. They were so kind of understanding. There wasn't that judgment that you fear might come from your employer when you basically say you're struggling. And so that process began, and I started having counselling, and I started taking medication, and I was beginning to start to feel like things were getting better. And then amidst this, Gemma began to feel unwell, and she began to have these headaches that were recurring and wouldn't go away. She starts to feel quite fatigued, but she'd struggled for a long time with insomnia that had started after having Ethan. And I think for anyone, and I'm sure there's people here, when you see a loved one struggling mentally, it's a really hard thing for you to see because you want to fix it, but you know ultimately it's going to be probably a long process. It might actually be a lifelong process. But it's really hard to see your loved one struggling. And I know she was really, really stressed and wondering, well, will Simon get his confidence back? Will he overcome this anxiety to go back to what he was doing and what he loves? And if he can't, what does that mean for family life? So on those trips to the doctors we had with her when things were getting progressively worse, the feeling from the doctor was, and we didn't really question it, and I think mentally I just wasn't in the place to really see what was going on. The doctor was like, I think this is induced by the stress of seeing what your husband is going through. So we get to kind of late November of 2017, and I remember this particular weekend, she is in a really bad way. She had no energy to get out of bed. We had an ensuite bathroom next to where we were, so literally 2 strides to get into the bathroom. She didn't move. I remember taking Ethan to the cinema to watch Paddington 2 just to give him something to do. He knows mummy's not well, but an 8-year-old's not really thinking anything more than she'll be up and about again in a couple of days. And we got to the Monday, and some friends of ours were really quite worried. I think this was, again, me not picking up on what was going on, and their close friend is a doctor, and they described what was going on with Gemma, and this doctor, via them, said, I really do think she needs to go into A&E today to find out what's going on. Only 3 days before, we sat with her doctor, who said, I'm satisfied there's nothing seriously wrong with you. So on that Monday night, we went into the A&E department in the Royal Berkshire Hospital in Reading, where we were living at the time. And it was a long night, lots of blood tests, and at about 4 o'clock in the morning, in comes the doctor. And I could already sense something unpleasant was coming. You can just kind of see their body language, their face. And in they came. And I remember the words. They just said, your wife's blood is deranged. She has a blood cancer of some sort. We don't know what. And really it felt at that moment like life was beginning to cartwheel utterly out of control. And by that Tuesday morning, being back to see Ethan, I told him Mummy was ill and in hospital, but didn't tell him any more than that. Definitely didn't use the C word at that point. And by later that morning, we are being blue lighted in an ambulance from Reading to Oxford to a specialist hospital called the Churchill Hospital there to find out which blood cancer it was. If anyone knows anything about blood cancer, there's a lot of different strains, so we didn't know at that point which one it was. And later that afternoon, she got diagnosed with a rare but sadly very, very aggressive form of blood cancer called acute myeloid leukemia. And she was given that afternoon a 50-50 chance of pulling through. She's 40 years of age. She celebrated her birthday back in the May of this year. So she's only 40. Ethan's 8. And we're being told she's got a 50-50 chance of pulling through. And you have to go for the glass half full again and think, well, we're going to hold on to that 50% chance she's going to be okay. We know this is going to be a long, long road to recovery, but we're going to believe that God is going to heal her and God is going to bring her through however long it takes. And that was really the feeling for the next couple of days. She responded really well to the intense chemotherapy she had immediately as we landed at that hospital. And we brought Ethan in once, again, didn't tell him the full extent of what was happening. I remember walking through the hospital and thinking, what am I going to say? Because he was at that curious age when he sees the wig shop, because it was already cancer specialist hospital. I don't want to tell him that's what may happen to Mum in a few months' time. Thankfully, he just saw W.H. Smith and the possibility of a magazine, so we got him a magazine. And really that week, it was looking okay, it was looking encouraging. And then on the Thursday night, everything began again to cartwheel out of control, and she just went very strange over the course of the night. Her consultant was brought in very early that morning, and it had been discovered that she'd fallen unconscious during the night. And what had happened is, what acute myeloid leukemia does, just very quickly, is it causes an explosion in your body's production of white blood cells. So Gemma's blood had become like a milkshake. You know, when you first try and drink it when it's frozen, it's quite hard to draw through the straw. As it unfreezes and thins, you can drink it much more easily. Her blood, with all these white blood cells, had become sludge-like, and it had damaged lots of little cell membranes in her brain. And so as the treatment worked and her blood thinned, it began to flow out of those perforations. And so we were told, well, I was told, in the room of doom, as I called it, with her consultant at 8:30 that Friday morning, he said, there is nothing we can do. She has catastrophic bleeding in her head. She will not see out today. And he said, you need to get your family in. You need to decide what you're going to do with your son in terms of telling him. He gave me some great advice. And so over the course of that day, friends and family came in, and we just had an immensely difficult... I prayed with the most faith, Ken, for the first few hours, that God would stop that bleeding, that God would intervene. My prayer was always the same. Please, Lord, do not leave my boy motherless. But the prayer was never answered, and as the day went on, it became time to say goodbye. So by 5:45, that Friday evening, nearly 7 years ago, she was gone.
And 7 years ago, it was our privilege to attend Gemma's funeral in Reading. We don't have all that much time now, Simon, but you shared in your book, Love Interrupted, some of the traumatic aftermath of that and how your faith was tested and how you handled it. And let's end in a little bit of time on the good note of your new family. But tell us how you got through that. What were your reactions? I know you were very desperate at the time.
Yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of people here who know what the grief journey is like. Grief fires off an absolute highly intense array of very difficult emotions. This 5 steps of grief is nonsense. Grief is complicated and it's very, very messy. And I was a mess for months upon months upon months. And I think actually in the early days, having a faith, because people ask me, does having a faith help you? I said it almost makes things more difficult, because if there is no God, if I have no belief in anything beyond this, then yeah, it's immensely cruel, it's hard, it's tough. But I'm not seeking answers to questions from God because I don't believe in a God. And I was immensely angry at God for a number of weeks after that day, because he hadn't answered my prayers. Gemma had left this life way too early. I'd now got a boy without a mum, and he's only 8 years of age. I was immensely angry, but I came to understand that it's okay for us to be angry at God. The Bible is full of people being angry at God, and our God is beyond big enough to take our anger. But I think as time went on, the question changed from why has this happened? Because I felt I was never going to get the answer to that question. And well-meaning Christians say, oh, one day you'll find out, one day in heaven it'll all make sense. And I'd go, rubbish. Because actually when we get to heaven, none of the worries of this world will matter anymore. It just won't. So actually I need to find peace with the fact I'm not going to find an answer this side of heaven and probably in heaven, and I won't need it in heaven. But it became, where are you, God, in all this? In the mess, in the hopelessness, in the myriad of questions when someone particularly dies young and they're an intrinsic part of your family. How does it work? Where does work go now? How do I bring up a boy on my own for the next few months, maybe years? It was, where are you, God, in all this? And I'll tell a couple of stories to finish off where, as I look back, God was really powerfully present during that time. There were plenty of times when it felt like he wasn't anywhere to be seen. But I remember the Saturday after the funeral you spoke about, and we were living in Reading at the time on this wonderful old farm estate that they converted into a number of families. And beyond the end of the communal land that surrounded our house was the River Thames. And it was a Saturday morning. The funeral was on the Thursday. And I was at my lowest. As anyone who's been through this will know, it's really after the funeral the true gravitas of what's happened hits. You kind of suspension before that, because often you're busy preparing for the funeral, but then it's like the big full stop and the proper grieving process begins. I was in the lowest of the lowest places, and I went out, sleep had gone out the window, as it often does with grief. At about 6 o'clock in the morning, there's a heavy fog, it's still quite dark because it's early December. And I sat by this tree as the light began to break through just next to the River Thames, and I just thought, I can't do this, cannot do this. I don't have the strength. I don't think I have the strength of faith to do this. I can't go on. And for a moment, I just wanted to roll into the Thames and give up. And two things happened. One is, straight away, the image of Ethan was very, very strong in my mind, and I thought, I cannot do this. You cannot leave my boy orphaned at the age of 8. But the other amazing thing that happened is that I had this really strong sense there was someone nearby. And I can still see his face now. And as I looked to my left, there was this really, really strong image of this man who was sat looking at me squarely in the eye. And there were tears in his eyes. And it felt like it was Jesus, who understands what it's like to lose, who wept tears at the tomb of Lazarus, who understands actually what true darkness is, which is when he died on the cross and suffered that separation from the Father. He experienced true darkness so that we will never experience true darkness. And in that moment, I felt like he was saying, however hard this is, I know I walk with you, and I am with you, and I love you. And then gone. And I just felt this surge of strength rise up in me. And I walked back to the house, and my sister Becky was there with the family like nothing had ever happened. But I always used to look back on that day, a little bit like I look back on the tree. And it was a really strong reminder that God was there. And the last story I'll tell on this was actually the day of the funeral. So after we'd had this big service at our church in Reading, we decided to have the last slot of the crematorium on that Thursday. So it's early December, the darkness is already coming. Just a weird day for me, just so full of emotion, but also very surreal. Is this really happening? And I remember we were stood outside the crematorium, the building, this horrid building, which is everything crematoriums shouldn't be. It was just devoid of hope. And through the darkness at the gates, the hearse appears. And I just remember sinking to my knees and just shouting across the cemetery, no. No, as in, no, this cannot be happening. But of course it is. And I remember an amazing man called Carl Beach, who I know really well. He was a really amazing Christian leader. He was amongst the family and friends who were with us. And they pulled me back to my feet. And he's got quite a gruff voice, and he was at the back. And he just said, I'm going to pray. He said, God, I pray right now that this man and this family, upon them your peace would descend. Amen. And into this little chapel we went, which was cold and not very nice. And there's only about 30 of us in there. And it was time to say goodbye. And as this song played out, which was, you know that song, you bring light in the darkness, you bring hope, you bring joy, you bring peace, played out. A friend of mine who was singing it came out of the rubbish old speakers. This amazing, remarkable, tangible peace descended on that place. So much so that as we went back to my house a few minutes later, a friend of mine called Graham, his wife doesn't really have a faith. And she said, I've never felt, and she said, that place was really horrible. She said, I've never felt a peace like I felt in that place. She said, the guy near me, I know he's got a really bad singing voice, but as he sang along to that song, she said, in her words, he sounded like an angel. And that is, for me, what those words that are used in the Bible mean. You know, that peace that passes all understanding. It's when God's peace comes into a place where there shouldn't be peace, when it comes into the chaos, when it comes into the pain, when it comes into the confusion, it breaks through our understanding of how peace works. And in that moment, in that horrible place, on that grimmest of days, there was that tangible sense of God's peace.
And just to finish, 30 seconds, you met Dorina. Bless you. Okay, you've got 2 little children. Can we see a picture of the family? There's Dorina, and
that's Theo, who arrived 4 months ago. Yeah, and that's all of us on holiday. Theo's in the bottom of the pram in his bassinet, and that's little Talitha. That's Ethan now, who's 50. Well, he's 15 in about 3 weeks' time. So that's where we're at now. And what I would say is, there was so much more we could say, is I believe one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the last 7 years is that, we often hear and we see it in songs, behold, I am a new creation. Behold, I'm doing a new thing, we see in the Bible. God is the God of second chances. God is like the ultimate restorer. I think back to the what's that amazing program on BBC One with Jay Blaze where they restore old things?
Repair
The Repair
Shop.
Shop. God is the ultimate craftsman. And he repairs and he rebuilds and he restores broken lives. And over the last 7 years, my testimony really is out of the ashes of 2017, God has rebuilt and he's restored me. And he's given me this amazing gift of another chance at being loved by another woman and loving her and having 2 more kids, even at the ripe old age of 51. It keeps you young.
Simon, it's just compelling and inspirational to listen to you. And we would love to have gone on and on and on. And people who want to fire questions at you, sit at your table over lunch. But just to say on behalf of all of us, thank you for sharing your story. Your book, Love Interrupted, is available on Amazon. So if you want to read the full story from Simon, and it's been my privilege to be associated with your family on a personal level for 40 years. And your dad, bless his memory, is one of 3 men who influenced me in my life and ministry. And I can see all the characteristics of Andrew as well, and the ability to communicate. So God bless you, and thank you for coming all the way from Hertfordshire and sharing your story with us. Let's say thank you.
Pleasure.